What happens when one of Britain's most beloved actors walks onto a morning talk show and finds himself blindsided by a host who seems determined to tear him down? In just 29 seconds of one shocking comment, Lorraine Kelly would turn what should have been a pleasant chat into a television moment that nobody in that studio would ever forget. McKellen had arrived at the studio that morning in good spirits. He was there to talk about his latest theater production, a passion project that meant the world to him. The legendary actor, known for his grace both on and off screen, settled into the bright orange sofa that faced Lorraine Kelly's desk. The studio lights were hot, the cameras were rolling, and the small studio audience was buzzing with excitement. Lorraine Kelly sat across from him, flanked by her regular panelists. To her left was entertainment correspondent Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair who often echoed whatever Lorraine said. To her right sat cultural critic Martin Hughes, a man who prided himself on asking tough questions but rarely challenged the host herself. The interview started pleasantly enough. Lorraine smiled her trademark smile and welcomed Ian to the show. "So lovely to have you here," she said, her Scottish accent warm and friendly. "You're looking well. Thank you for having me," Ian replied, his voice carrying that distinctive theatrical quality that had charmed audiences for decades. "I'm delighted to be here. Now, you're here to talk about your new production," Lorraine continued, glancing down at her notes. "King Lear? Is that right?" "Yes, that's correct," Ian said, leaning forward slightly. His eyes lit up as he began to speak about the project. "It's a production I've wanted to do for years now. The role of Lear is something that, I think, requires a certain life experience to fully understand. The madness, the rage, the vulnerability." Lorraine nodded, but there was something in her expression that suggested she wasn't really listening. Sarah Mitchell jumped in from the side. "It must be quite physically demanding, though, at your age?" The question hung in the air for just a moment too long. Ian's smile didn't falter, but something shifted in his eyes. "Well, yes, theater is always demanding. But age brings wisdom to these roles." "But seriously," Lorraine interjected, cutting across him, "aren't you worried about, forgetting your lines? I mean, it's a long play, isn't it?" The studio went quiet. Even the audience seemed to sense that something was off. Ian straightened in his seat. "I'm sorry? Well, you're not exactly a spring chicken, are you?" Lorraine said with a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm just saying, at 70-something, memorizing all those lines must be quite the challenge." 86? Ian corrected quietly. "I'm 86 years old." "Right, yes, 86, Lorraine said, waving her hand, dismissively. "Even more impressive then, I suppose. But come on, be honest with us. How many times do you actually forget your lines during a performance?" Martin Hughes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Lorraine, I think what Ian is trying to say is that experience actually helps with." "I'm talking to Ian, Martin," Lorraine snapped, not even looking at her panelist. She turned back to the actor. "So? How often?" Ian's jaw tightened. The legendary composure he was known for was being tested. "I don't forget my lines, Lorraine. I'm a professional. I've been doing this for over 60 years. "Oh, come on," Lorraine said, laughing again. That laugh was starting to grate. "Everyone forgets things when they get older. My mom's the same. Can't remember what she had for breakfast most days. It's nothing to be ashamed of." "Are you comparing me to your mother's memory problems?" Ian asked. His voice still calm, but with an edge to it now. Sarah Mitchell tried to intervene, sensing the tension. "Maybe we should talk about the production itself? The director is quite acclaimed, isn't he?" But Lorraine wasn't done. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, clearly enjoying herself. No, I think this is important. Our viewers need to know what they're paying for when they buy tickets. If Ian's up there on stage and suddenly goes blank, they should know that's a possibility. That is completely unprofessional." Ian said, his voice rising slightly. "You're suggesting I can't do my job because of my age?" "I'm just being realistic," Lorraine shot back. "It's called journalism, Ian. Asking the tough questions. Maybe you're not used to that anymore. Maybe everyone just tells you how wonderful you are all the time." The audience was dead silent now. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. Martin Hughes looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Sarah Mitchell was staring at her notes, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. "I came here to discuss my work," Ian said, his voice steady but clearly fighting to keep his emotions in check, not to be insulted on national television. Insulted? Lorraine's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Who's insulting you? I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You're an old man doing a young man's job. There, I said it. A young man's job? Ian repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. Shakespeare wrote Lear as an old man. That's the entire point of the character. Yes, but Shakespeare didn't have to worry about health and safety regulations, did he? Lorraine said, smirking now. What happens if you collapse on stage? Have you thought about that? This is unbelievable, Ian muttered, shaking his head. What was that? Lorraine leaned forward, cupping her ear in an exaggerated gesture. Sorry, you'll have to speak up. Or is the hearing going too? That was it. That was the moment. Ian McKellen, the man who had played Gandalf and Magneto, who had been knighted for his services to theater, who had spent his entire life bringing joy and art to millions of people, stood up from the bright orange sofa. I will not sit here and be disrespected like this, he said, his voice clear and powerful, filling the entire studio. Oh, sit down, Ian, Lorraine said, rolling her eyes. Don't be so dramatic. This is what we do here. We have real conversations. Real conversations? Ian's voice was incredulous now. You call this a real conversation? You've done nothing but mock my age since I sat down. You've questioned my ability to do the work I've dedicated my life to. You've compared me to someone with memory problems? Sarah Mitchell finally found her voice. Ian, I'm sure Lorraine didn't mean it like that. Oh, I absolutely meant it like that, Lorraine interrupted, looking directly at Sarah with a sharp glance. Stop trying to smooth things over, Sarah. I'm tired of everyone walking on eggshells around these so-called national treasures. So-called? Ian's voice was quiet now, which was somehow more powerful than if he'd shouted. Is that what you think? I think you've had a good run, Lorraine said, shrugging. But maybe it's time to step aside and let younger actors have a chance. How many more years are you going to cling to these roles? Martin Hughes finally spoke up, his voice shaking slightly. Lorraine, this has gone too far. Has it, Martin? Lorraine turned on him now, her voice sharp. Or have we finally stopped pretending? Ian McKellen is old. He's past his prime. And someone needed to say it. The studio audience started to murmur. A few people actually gasped. Ian stood there, looking down at Lorraine. And for a moment, he said nothing. He just stared at her. And the disappointment on his face was more devastating than any angry outburst could have been. I have been in this industry for decades, Ian said slowly, deliberately. I have worked with the greatest actors, the greatest directors. I have performed in the West End, on Broadway, in films seen by millions. And never, not once, have I been treated with such contempt. Oh, please, Lorraine said, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. The audience was clearly on Ian's side now, and she could feel it. You invited me here under false pretenses, Ian continued. You said you wanted to discuss my work, my craft, my art. Instead, you've used this platform to belittle me, to suggest I'm not capable, to imply that my age makes me worthless. I never said worthless. Lorraine tried to interject. You didn't have to say the word, Ian said, cutting her off. Your meaning was perfectly clear, but let me tell you something, Lorraine. Age is not a weakness. Experience is not a liability, and the fact that you think it is says far more about you than it does about me. The audience broke into scattered applause. Lorraine's face was turning red now. She clearly hadn't expected this to backfire on her so spectacularly. You can't. Just walk out of an interview, she said, her voice rising. We're live on air. Watch me, Ian said simply. He reached down and unclipped the microphone from his jacket. The sound technician in the corner looked panicked, but Ian carefully placed the microphone on the arm of the sofa, not throwing it, not making a dramatic gesture, just setting it down with the same dignity he'd carried throughout the entire exchange. Ian, come on, Sarah Mitchell said, her voice pleading now. Let's just take a breath and start over. There's nothing to start over, Ian said, looking at her kindly. This isn't your fault, Sarah, but I won't stay somewhere I'm not respected. You're making a mountain out of a molehill? Lorraine said, but her voice had lost its bite. She was scrambling now, realizing that this was not going the way she'd planned. Am I? Ian asked, turning back to face her one last time. Let me ask you something, Lorraine. If a younger actor had walked onto your show, would you have spent the entire interview questioning their ability to remember lines? Would you have compared them to someone with dementia? Would you have suggested they should retire? Lorraine opened her mouth, but no words came out. "That's what I thought," Ian said softly. "You targeted me because you thought my age made me an easy target. You thought you could score cheap points by mocking an old man. But you forgot something." "What's that?" Lorraine asked, her voice barely above a whisper now. "I've been dealing with critics like you my entire life," Ian said. "And I'm still here. I'm still working. I'm still creating. And I'll be doing this work long after people have forgotten this interview." The audience erupted into applause now, loud and sustained. Several people stood up. Lorraine looked around the studio, her face a mixture of anger and something that might have been embarrassment. "You can't just leave," she said again, but it sounded desperate now. "I absolutely can," Ian replied. "And I am." He turned toward the exit, his back straight, his head held high. Martin Hughes started clapping from the panel desk, slowly at first, then more enthusiastically. Sarah Mitchell looked between Martin and Lorraine, clearly torn, before she too began to applaud. Lorraine sat frozen in her chair, her mouth set in a thin line. "This is completely unprofessional," she said, but no one was listening to her anymore. The studio was filled with the sound of applause for Ian McKellen. As Ian walked toward the studio door, a producer rushed up to him, clipboard in hand, looking absolutely terrified. "Mr. McKellen, please, if you could just—" Ian held up a hand, stopping the producer mid-sentence. "I was promised a respectful interview about my work. That is not what happened here today. I'm leaving." "But we still have 12 minutes left in the segment," the producer pleaded. "Then I suggest you find something else to fill the time," Ian said, calmly. "Perhaps Lorraine can spend it reflecting on how she treats her guests." Behind him, Lorraine finally found her voice again. "Fine, go. We don't need you anyway. We'll find someone else who actually wants to be here." Ian paused at the door and turned back one final time. "You know what the saddest part of this is? Lorraine, I actually admired you. I thought you were one of the good ones, but today you've shown your true colors. Get out," Lorraine said, her face fully red now, her hands gripping the edges of her desk. "I'm going," Ian said. "But before I do, I want to say something to your audience." He looked directly at the camera, addressing the viewers at home. "To anyone watching who's ever been made to feel less than because of their age, because of who they are, because someone in power decided to use their platform to tear you down, please know this. Your worth is not determined by people like this. Your value doesn't diminish because someone else says it does." "Turn off his microphone," Lorraine shouted to the control room. But Ian wasn't using a microphone anymore. His voice, trained by decades on stage, carried perfectly through the studio without any amplification at all. "Keep doing what you love," Ian continued. "Keep creating, keep working, keep living. Don't let anyone tell you that you're past your time. You decide when your time is done, nobody else." And with that, Ian McKellen walked out of the studio. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. The studio remained in chaos. The audience was still on their feet, some of them actually cheering now. Sarah Mitchell had tears in her eyes. Martin Hughes looked shell-shocked. And Lorraine Kelly sat at her desk, isolated, alone, realizing too late that she had just made a terrible mistake. "Well," she said, trying to compose herself, trying to regain control of her show. "That was certainly dramatic, but nobody was buying." The producers were frantically speaking into their headsets. The cameramen were looking at each other, unsure what to do. The audience was still focused on the door Ian had walked through, as if hoping he might come back. "Let's take a break," Lorraine finally said, her voice tight. "We'll be right back." As the cameras cut and the commercial break began, Lorraine sat there, her perfect television smile finally cracking. Sarah Mitchell immediately stood up and walked off the panel without a word. Martin Hughes followed her, and Lorraine Kelly was left sitting alone at her desk in the middle of her own show, abandoned by her guest, her panelists, and the respect of everyone in that room. The producers rushed onto the set surrounding Lorraine, but she just sat there, staring at the empty sofa where Ian McKellen had been sitting just moments before. The bright orange cushions seemed to mock her now, a reminder of the warmth and welcome that should have defined this interview, but never did. In the green room, Ian McKellen was collecting his coat. A young assistant approached him nervously. "Mr. McKellen, I just wanted to say I thought you were absolutely right. What she said to you was horrible." Ian smiled at the young woman, a genuine smile full of kindness. "Thank you, dear. That's very kind of you to say." "I can't believe she treated you like that," the assistant continued. "Everyone here loves your work. We were all so excited when we heard you were coming on the show. These things happen, Ian said, buttoning his coat. Not everyone is equipped to have respectful conversations. Will you ever come back? The assistant asked. Ian considered the question for a moment, then shook his head gently. I don't think so. Life's too short to spend time with people who don't value you. Back in the studio, the commercial break was ending. Lorraine had attempted to fix her hair and reapply her lipstick, but the damage was done. When the cameras came back on, she was sitting alone at her desk. Sarah and Martin had refused to return to the panel. Welcome back, Lorraine said, her voice brittle. As you saw, our guest Ian McKellen decided to leave the show. Very unprofessional behavior, I have to say. But even she seemed to know how hollow that sounded. The audience sat in stony silence. Not a single person clapped or responded. Moving on, Lorraine said quickly, shuffling her papers. Our next segment is about summer fashion trends. But nobody was interested in summer fashion trends. The interview with Ian McKellen, or rather, the disaster that had unfolded in place of an interview, was all anyone could think about. It was the only thing anyone wanted to talk about. Outside the studio, Ian McKellen climbed into a waiting car. The driver looked at him with concern. Everything all right, sir? Everything's fine, Ian said, settling into the back seat. Just fine. As the car pulled away from the studio, Ian looked out the passive window at the gray London sky. He thought about all the interviews he'd done over the years, all the conversations, all the questions. Most had been pleasant. Some had been challenging in good ways, pushing him to think deeper about his work. But this had been something else entirely. He wasn't angry anymore. If anything, he felt sorry for Lorraine Kelly. Sorry that she thought the way to make interesting television was to tear people down. Sorry that she'd lost sight of what real conversation looked like. Sorry that she'd traded respect for what she probably thought would be viral moments. But mostly, he just felt tired. Tired of having to prove himself. Tired of being questioned about his ability simply because he'd lived long enough to accumulate years along with his accolades. Tired of a culture that seemed to value youth above experience, novelty above expertise. The car drove through the London streets, past theaters where Ian had performed, past landmarks he'd seen, change and evolve over his long career. The city itself was a reminder that beautiful things could last, that age didn't diminish value, that history and tradition mattered. His phone began to buzz in his pocket, messages from friends and colleagues who'd already heard what happened. News traveled fast in their industry, but Ian didn't check his phone. He just watched the city roll past, thinking about King Lear, about the production he was preparing for, about the work that still lay ahead. Because that was the thing Lorraine Kelly didn't understand, couldn't understand. The work wasn't just a job to Ian McKellen, it was his life, his passion, his purpose. And no talk show host, no matter how rude or dismissive, could take that away from him. Back at the studio, the show limped to its conclusion. Lorraine tried to maintain her composure, tried to continue as if nothing had happened, but everyone could see the cracks. Her smile was forced, her energy was off. The usually fluid rhythm of her show felt disjointed and awkward. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the show went off air, Lorraine stood up from her desk and walked straight to her dressing room without speaking to anyone. The studio staff exchanged glances but said nothing. What was there to say? In her dressing room, Lorraine sat down heavily in front of her mirror. She looked at her reflection, at the perfectly styled hair and the professionally applied makeup. But underneath all that, she saw something she didn't like. She saw someone who'd crossed a line. Someone who'd confused being provocative with being cruel. Her phone was already exploding with notifications. The interview was everywhere. Clips were being shared. People were talking about it. But not in the way Lorraine had hoped. They weren't praising her for asking tough questions. They weren't applauding her for being fearless. They were condemning her for being disrespectful. They were calling her out for ageism. They were standing with Ian McKellen. Meanwhile, somewhere across London, Ian McKellen sat in his study at home. He poured himself a cup of tea and opened the script for King Lear. The pages were already well worn, covered in notes and annotations. He'd been working on this role for months, preparing, studying, understanding. He read through one of Lear's great speeches about age and wisdom and the cruelty of children who turn on their parents. There was something almost funny about it now, given what had just happened. Shakespeare had understood, hundreds of years ago, that youth could be callous, that power could corrupt, that respect was not always given where it was due. But Ian McKellen was still here, still working, still creating, still bringing these words to life for new audiences. And that, he thought, taking a sip of his tea. That was the best response of all. Not anger, not bitterness, but simply continuing to do the work he loved, with the skill and dedication he'd honed over a lifetime. The story of what happened in that studio would spread far and wide. People would talk about it for days, weeks, maybe longer. But in the end, what would be remembered? Not Lorraine Kelly's cruel questions, not her dismissive attitude, not her attempts to belittle a legend. What would be remembered was Ian McKellen's dignity, his composure, his refusal to accept disrespect, and his powerful reminder that age was not a weakness but a strength, that experience was not a liability but an asset, that respect was not optional but essential. He set down his teacup and returned to his script. There was work to be done. There was always work to be done, and Ian McKellen, at 86 years old, was just getting started.